All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. Good afternoon. Today's webinar is on exploring the impacts of e-commerce on urban transportation, land use, and shopping behavior. My name is Sarah Schramer. I'm the Interim Policy Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and before we get started, I just want to do a quick introduction. This is part of a webinar series sponsored by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. NCST is part of the University Transportation Centers program administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation and is a consortium of 6 universities, or 7 now, I believe, around the country focused on advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. Today's webinar will last 1 hour. We're going to have presentations from Dr. Miguel Jayer of the University of California, Davis, and Dr. Genevieve Giuliano of the University of Southern California. And at the end, we'll open it up for questions for Q&A. We are going to be recording this webinar, and the recording will be available on our website along with the slides in the next day or two. And with that, let's jump into our presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Miguel Jayer, who will be speaking first. He is Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UC Davis and co-director of ITS Davis Sustainable Freight Program. He's had a long time focus in areas including freight transportation and humanitarian logistics, and he's the lead author of a recently published NCST report examining the national impacts of e-commerce growth. And with that, I will turn it over to Miguel to share some of his key findings with us.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. Before I start, I just want to say it's a pleasure to share this time with Professor Giuliano. So thanks for the opportunity. So what I'm going to be presenting now is some of the results of a project in which we set to develop a tool to estimate the impacts into the future from e-commerce travel and emissions. So as you can imagine, there are things that can happen from now until 2050. So this was our best attempt to try to estimate those trends and changes. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the research team, some of my students that work in this project, Ivan Zhao, Sarah Dennis, Daniel Rivera, and Amol Pawa. So do acknowledgements to them. So we have been working for a long time on trying to identify or trying to answer the question, is e-retailing, is e-commerce and this channel more sustainable than traditional retailing? And that's actually one of the key tenets on some of the work that we're doing, some of the work that are done in city logistics and urban freight transportation, given the increasing share of e-commerce and residential deliveries in every city around the world. So what do we know? Well, a couple of years ago, I did a project in which basically I analyzed the different channels and trying to assess the energy and emissions from the different components of the footprint of every product that gets delivered to a household. And we did this at the retail level, an e-retailer, a pure e-retailer, and then what will be the best case in an efficient e-retailer. And as you can see here in these 3 bars that you see on these 4 graphs, the traditional retailer can be better than an e-retailer if there are no economies of scale, if the e-retailer doesn't have enough market share and so on. That being said, when the e-retailer is efficient and have a larger market share, now things change a little bit in which e-retailing can be better in terms of energy and emissions. And if you look at the different components of that energy and emissions in terms of how much is because of the data centers and the headquarters, the freight energy, the upstream freight, packaging, customer transport, warehouse and retail, and last mile deliveries and computer network, we can see that the retail side is basically dominated by people traveling to the stores and the retail energy and emissions. When we look into the e-retailing side, we see that kind of the analogy to that will be the last mile deliveries. And here we see that in terms of packaging, customer transport for returns, and the last mile deliveries, we're already talking about 60 to 65% of all the emissions and energy. Again, I did this a couple of years ago, working more. I think these initial estimates were under estimating the upstream freight and all the movement that are needed to actually make every product available to your doorstep in a matter of hours. So what are the main consideration is, yes, sustainable or e-retailers can be more sustainable than traditional retailing. There are many factors that will affect this. So we have been working on other projects and trying to assess those factors. So what can be some of those that affect? Well, we have from the demand side, we have how much is people buying, what are the channels that are choosing, what are the travel patterns that they do, how they travel for shopping, are they biking, walking, are they using a large gasoline SUV, or are they taking public transit? How much are they buying every time they make a purchase? What is the basket size? From the delivery standpoint, what is the distribution network? What is the design? What are the facilities? Are delivery vehicles coming and traveling across the city to deliver your package, or are the delivery hubs, efficiently and strategically located nearby the customers? What are the distances? What are the type of vehicles that the companies are using to deliver those cargoes? How much consolidation they can get on each of those vehicles? What are the services that they are offering? Are they offering traditional delivery, or are they offering expedited and rush deliveries? Are they delivering to your house, or are they going to alternative delivery locations? Are you buying online and then clicking and then picking up at the store? And are you keeping everything that you buy, or are you returning? So all of these factors affect the final answer of, is e-retailing better or not than traditional retailing? And many academics and many practitioners and consultants have been trying to analyze some of these aspects. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on kind of the aggregate travel behaviors, shopping behavior from people, the delivery patterns. Professor Giuliano is going to go more in depth, more behavioral analysis on some of these strategies. So what else is going on? Well, it has been really hard to forecast what will happen in the future. I mean, e-commerce have been growing for the last more than a decade, kind of double-digit growth. So everybody's asking, where will this stop? Will this stop? Will be kind of the steady state between e-retailing and retailing? Will one dominate? Will they coexist? So we wanted to look into what can we analyze in terms of those trends. The next question that we wanted to look at is, are the impacts the same everywhere, or do they differ geographically? And if there are negative consequences, what can be done? And that's just taking into evaluating some of the strategies. So how do we do it? Well, we analyze trends. And as I was mentioning, e-commerce have been growing really fast. So this graph shows you the share of the e-retails over the total sales of retail. And as you can see, even from the start in 2013, the share of e-retail was about between 5 and 6%. And just before the pandemic, we reached 11%. And just in 2 quarters during the pandemic, when we switched to basically buying online, being at home, and requiring everything to be delivered to us, there was a huge jump in some of those, in the share of how much was bought online as opposed to in stores. Those 2 or 3 quarters, there was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know what was happening. We started the project, so we were kind of concerned on what will be the validity of doing the analysis, given that we were going to be using most of historic data. Will the historic data kind of show a pattern, considering that huge jump? As you can see, what happened in 2021, what had been happening in 2022, is that growth, even though still fast, still growing a lot, it have not grown at the pace that it did in the few quarters at the beginning of the pandemic. And we're getting close to the pre-pandemic trend. Still growth, but not as accelerated as what it was experienced. So overall, we developed an approach is a 5-stage econometric modeling, Monte Carlo simulation, time series analysis, and scenario-based modeling, in which, well, we are trying to identify 4 main things. One is, how will the population look in the future? What are the chances that that population, given those characteristics, will shop in a day, not shop in a day, shop online, or shop both in a store and online? How will people travel, or how are they traveling today? What we expect to happen in the future? What are the last mile distribution? What are the missions associated to the vehicles of people traveling to shopping and vehicles delivering goods? And a few scenarios. So we use several data sets. So the main 2 are the National Household Travel Survey, that is already kind of old. We're waiting for the new one, that is from 2017, the previous one. But we use the American Time Use Survey. We use data for almost 15 years, and we created time series analysis on those. And we estimated shopping behavioral models. So basically, we estimate the likelihood of people not shopping in a day again, shopping online, shopping in a store, or shopping both in a store and online in a given day. We then estimated the travel patterns, and I'll show you a little bit more. And finally, through Monte Carlo simulation, we estimated the market share of all those channels every decade in 6 MSAs: New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, and Washington, D.C. So just to show you, we estimated those behavioral models. So here in this slide, we have the share of the proportion of people in each of those MSAs that will buy online in a store or not buying at all. And you can see that in some of those locations, let's say we look at Los Angeles, we are only expecting a decrease in no shopping. That means a few more people will shop within a day, and either online or both, or in a store. In some other cases, we see kind of steady, not as pronounced like in San Francisco, but the online and both are actually increasing several times, even though in one single day, the percentage of the people is not that large. So we only reach about 50% of the people by 2050 buying on every day online. So we did this across several population scenarios of moderate and high growth, and several shopping scenarios of moderate and high growth. Why did we analyze this? Is because basically the trends only show kind of a marginal increase year after year. I wanted to see what could happen under different scenarios. So the graph that we have in this slide are the average across all scenarios and all the runs that we did in the Monte Carlo simulation. In terms of shopping travel, a couple of years ago, we published a paper in which we developed a methodology to estimate shopping travel. So in this case, shopping travel is any travel that you do in which at least one activity is related to shopping. And we decompose this into several steps. The first one is estimating the number of shopping tours that a person can do in a day. And again, a shopping tour is not necessarily that the main purpose is shopping, but at least one activity is shopping. And as you can see, on average, most people will do between 1 and 2, most likely one shopping tour in a day when they shop. We also look into how many stops do they do along that shopping tour. And again, it will be 1 or 2. It actually decays really fast in terms of the number of stops per tour. Why did we go through the trouble of analyzing the number of stops, the distances, and so on? Is because we wanted just to quantify the marginal contribution to travel and emissions because of the shopping, whether in the store or not. So if you are going out and stopping in 10 places and only one of those you are doing shopping, well, the rationale behind the analysis is that when you take out the shopping out, or the in-store shopping that was part of that tour, we are only taking that marginal contribution to the tour that was because of shopping. We also analyze, as I mentioned, the distance by shopping tour in each of the cities. We see kind of the different patterns in terms of distances, and we found that this is kind of correlated to the density of locations within a geographic area. And when we look into, at least in the data from the American Time Use Survey, on the most shares of people that shop, most of the shopping is done using private vehicles. Only in cities with higher or better access to transit is that we saw kind of the transit share or the active mode share to be higher. Again, this is important when we want to analyze kind of the trade-off between online shopping and in-store, because it's not the same as substituting a shopping activity that was done walking to the store at the bodega in the corner versus a vehicle coming in from a warehouse or a distribution center in the outskirts of the city. So we analyze the total impacts in terms of BMT and emissions for some pollutants for the different channels across the different years. And we do this the census tract level. That's our level of analysis. And I just want to make a note that this graph that you see on the right, in which you have in a store, online, and both, and 2020, 2030, 2040, and 2050, that is at the census tract level, but how much is generated by that census tract. It doesn't mean that the travel is only at that census tract, but how much is that census tract generating, and the travel will happen somewhere in the region. In terms of BMT, we are expecting, at least from New York, in which there was an increase in online shopping and in both, that there will be an increase in BMT. And there is a kind of a correlation between the BMT and the emissions. We are using emission rates. What you see then is a trade-off between the type of pollutants, whether we're talking about light-duty vehicles, passenger people traveling to shopping, or delivery vehicles that can have some of the more NOx or PM. So there are going to be impacts. What are kind of the good news? The good news are that most companies now are investing on kind of decreasing the footprint of the deliveries. There are technologies today, let's say truck electrification and vehicles that can mitigate some of the impact, especially from the delivery point of view, but there are still nuances in terms of how much people is going to buy. And we always get to, the more efficient we get, probably the costs are lower, and we end up buying more and consuming more. And unless stuff appears at your house, goods are going to be moved, whether to stores or to household, and there's always going to be an impact. So we developed some scenarios trying to assess the impact of some of the strategies. So the first one is electrification. So we implemented some scenarios, and we did electrification both on the light duty side, on people traveling for shopping, and on the truck side. And here you can see in 2030, we assume about 25% of the fleet light duty vehicles are going to be electrified, and about 30% of the trucks. That goes to 50 and 75, and then 75 and 100% by 2050. That's mostly assuming some of the policies that are being implemented in states like California, and some other states like New York State are following. So as expected, if we are only considering tailpipe emissions as you electrify vehicles, some of those emissions are going to decrease. How fast? Well, it will depend on the interaction between the trade-off between, again, the people traveling and the trucks going to households or alternative delivery locations. Something that we are not including in the analysis is that the more trucks can have an impact on congestion. We are not considering congestion at this level of analysis. The next one is, well, what are some other trends that may be worrisome? And is the proliferance of faster and faster deliveries. And why do I pay attention, and some other academics pay attention to reducing the time windows for deliveries? That as you reduce time windows, there is less capacity to consolidate. And as you consolidate less, then you're going to be sending less products within a single vehicle. It could be maybe a shorter delivery tour, but depending on where your distribution facility is located, you are still going to have for each of those delivery tours, the first leg going to the first customer and the last leg going back to your depot. And if you are delivering less amount of products every time you send out a vehicle, that means you are incurring in more of those first and last legs of that delivery tour. Therefore, you are increasing the footprint of every single product that you deliver. So we developed some scenarios, and if you look only on CO2, then this will be the baseline. If we go to a case in which we increase the rush deliveries, and the way we implemented this is reducing the consolidation level in the trucks, we see that the emissions associated to the deliveries, both from the people that are only shopping online or the people that are buying online and in a store, also increases. And we quantify that could be 2 to 3 times impact. So it can be quite high of an impact if we continue on that. In that case, we need to educate consumers in the sense that even though you are not paying more to get those products in 1 hour, in 2 hours, there is an externality associated to those decisions. We also analyze the other current trend in last mile deliveries, that is with respect to the use of crowd shipping. And some companies are using third-party crowd shipping services and platforms. Some others are using crowd shippers that basically directly to their company. And we analyze what will happen if more and more of the deliveries are being implemented through crowd shipping. One of the main differences that are driving the scenarios is that crowd shippers are mainly used today for the shorter delivery time windows deliveries. They are using usually light duty vehicles, and they have less items per delivery tour. So there is always a trade-off between a higher capacity vehicle in a longer delivery route, as opposed to a smaller vehicle in a shorter delivery window. So we found that if there is nothing related to rush deliveries, it's just that we are maximizing the capacity and efficiency where it's needed on those crowd shippers, there could be actually a reduction in emissions if we use light duty vehicles. That being said, this does not take into account traffic impacts of these additional vehicles. Just to give you an idea, usually a delivery van from a carrier can deliver 200 to 300 packages in a 8-hour time window or delivery tour. These crowd shippers are delivering 20 to 30 packages, and usually in 2 to 3 hours. So we are kind of in a magnitude of 10 crowd shipper vehicles versus 1 delivery van. So there's going to be more traffic. But at least at the tailpipe, if there are no rush and they can deliver without delivery time windows, there could be a benefit without considering the traffic again. So finally, what we found is the impacts do differ geographically, and that's because of the composition of the city, the forecast of the share of the demographics in each of those MSAs, and also the historic behavior related to shopping and patterns. We found that in some cases, for instance, New York City could see a 3-time increase in BMT associated to shopping by 2050, whereas other cities may actually experience a decline. But the declines are quite marginal. Increases in BMT from online shopping could be offset by that trade-off between people traveling and the delivery vehicles if they're able to consolidate. And also, it's important to acknowledge that the more we actually substitute personal travel for shopping for a delivery vehicle bringing the goods to you, the more we can reap the benefits of consolidation of goods. Something that is important that will affect how all this plays out, especially as we buy more online, is land use planning. If we do not allocate enough space or integrate e-commerce and e-commerce activity, the freight activity, the intensity of freight activity associated to e-commerce into our urban planning and semi-urban planning, we are not going to be able to reduce kind of the, let's say, the BMT of vehicles traveling across the city from outside where land is cheaper and there is access to highways and so on. So if we do adequate land use planning, we are able to mitigate some of those impacts. There is no doubt that cleaner vehicles and newer technologies are going to be able to reduce some of the footprint, given that we can substitute, let's say, a diesel truck for a zero emission truck. But we cannot forget that operational strategies, behavioral related strategies for demand management can go a long way on mitigating future impacts. And with that, I'm done, and I'll wait for questions later on.
All right, thank you, Miguel. Yeah, and for folks who more recently joined, we are going to have time at the end for Q&A. So please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform if you haven't already. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Genevieve Giuliano. She is Professor and Margaret and John Ferraro Chair in Effective Local Government at the University of Southern California. Dr. Giuliano's research areas include relationships between land use and transportation, transportation policy analysis, travel behavior, and information technology applications in transportation. Dr. Giuliano will be sharing her insights from a recently published NCST report focused on travel behavior in e-commerce. And I'll pass it over to you, Jen. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute.
I thought I was going to get that out of the way earlier. Thanks everybody for inviting me, and thanks. It's really great to share the stage with Miguel. He always has amazing research to share with us. We're going actually from the broad forecasting that Miguel has done to something that is really very localized. And that's looking at particularly parcel lockers as one way to try to address all of the externalities that Miguel talked about in his presentation. I want to start by acknowledging my students. None of these projects can be done without our students. Jae-Hyun Ha, who is a PhD student, Robert Binder, a PhD student, and Andrea Holmes, who is a master's student. So this was definitely a group project. So I'm going to start by just talking about a little bit of background, even though Miguel did a really nice job. One of the reasons that e-commerce is giving us such challenges is that, as Miguel said, as we increase demand and as we have demand for faster deliveries, like same day deliveries, we reduce the efficiency on the freight side, on the freight delivery side. And as we go to these very short delivery times, the supply chain has to change because the goods have to be close enough to the population to make all of this work. So we are seeing, sort of a growing complexity of the supply chain, and at the same time, the growth and diversity of what people purchase online. There are some major challenges with last mile delivery. The first one, of course, is the environmental impacts of light and medium duty trucks in urban areas. The second is that there's kind of a built-in efficiency with deliveries because of the share of delivery failures, which creates a need for more deliveries, and the much higher rate of returns that we see with online purchases. So one of the concepts that people have been thinking about is to try to reduce last mile deliveries. And one way to do that is to identify what are called collection delivery points or pickup points. And what happens here is that we have, for example, Amazon has a set of lockers that are coded so that so that several deliveries can be made to the pickup area. And then the customer at any time can come and pick up the package. So by doing this, we can reduce the last mile, the VMT associated with last mile deliveries, because I can reduce the number of truck VMT. I can reduce delivery failures, and therefore I can increase delivery and efficiency and speed. Now, if APL's automated parcel lockers as a VMT reduction strategies are to work, we need a couple of things. One is that we need customer willingness to use them. And if the more customers willing to use them, the more possibilities there are for parcel consolidation, and therefore the more possibilities for reducing truck VMT. We also have to look at the customer's pickup attributes. So if the customer uses transit or non-motorized modes, then there's a savings on the passenger side, and that would maximize the VMT reduction benefits. If people are driving, particularly if they're driving as a single purpose trip, then we're getting miles on the customer side that are going to offset that benefit. If people trip chain these rides, then the sort of net increase in passenger VMT is going to be a little bit less. So the actual outcomes of APLs as kind of a VMT reduction strategy really depends on what people do. So we were very interested in the use of parcel lockers. We were very interested in who uses them. This remains a rare event. Our best estimate is that of all online shoppers, about 7% have used an APL. So it's a very small share of everybody out there who is online shopping at this point. But we wanted to see, you know, what's the potential of what we can learn and understand about the people who are using them now, and how that might inform whether this strategy is worth pursuing to make a substantial impact. So we had a set of research questions, many of them very simple, you know, just figuring out who uses the APLs, why are they used, how are they used, how do people get there? And then looking at all the relationships between all those factors. We conducted our own survey of APL users. There's no data on this that I know of anywhere else. And then we did an analysis using latent class analysis. So just to give you an introduction of what is a parcel locker, I have some pictures on the left. The students went out and did a whole lot of field work to observe where these lockers were, how people use them, etc. And on your right, what you see with all those dots are a piece of Los Angeles, this part of central area of Los Angeles. And if I can use my pointer right here, this is downtown LA. So we looked around, we wanted to, our first approach was to do an intercept survey because the greatest likelihood of finding anybody who uses APL lockers is at the locker site itself, right? So the red dots are the top 10 lockers as identified by Amazon. Amazon gave us the data for that information. And the blue dots are the top 10 based on the number of Google reviews, which is what we tried before we got the data from Amazon. And all the black dots are all the other locker locations. In the LA metro area, there are 400 and some odd lockers at this point. Okay, so as I said, we decided the only way to do this was to conduct our own survey. This research is kind of part of a larger research project on online shopping. So this is actually the second survey that we conducted. It had questions on online shopping behavior, the rationale for using APLs, how people use them, and as much as we could get on how people access the APO and their demographics. We, of course, had to find people that had used an APL, and our criterion was if you had used one within the last month, and our targeted area was the LA region. As I mentioned, we started out this project with intending to do intercept surveys at APL locations. We were stymied by COVID, and we decided then to move on to a third-party online survey distributor. So we have actually a combination of surveys from both sources. In this slide, in this table, you can see that our total, we knew that we would not get a large sample. There was just no way to get a large sample. So our target was about 200. We thankfully did better than that. But you see that there was a lot of missing data. So we ended up with a sample of 289. It's really important to understand that this is not a representative sample of regional population. As you might imagine, people who use lockers tend to be younger. We had more respondents with higher than average education. We had many fewer Hispanics than are in the LA population, and we had a lot more full-time workers. So this is a sample of APL users, not a sample of the population. And then the figure on the right gives you the location of all of our survey respondents. And you can see that they're pretty well spread around the LA Orange County area. Okay, so we did a descriptive analysis, and then as I mentioned, we did a latent class analysis. And latent class analysis works by using a set of indicators to identify observations into a set of groups or classes. Those indicators in our case are behavioral outcomes. So how often you are an online shopper, or how often you shop online, how often you use APLs, how you usually receive your packages, how you usually travel to your APL destination when you go. So all of these have several variables within them, but that's what was used to come up with a set of classes. We ended up with 4 different classes, and I'll describe them in a minute. And then the next step in the analysis is to explain the factors associated with those classes. And so we had a set of what we call covariates. That's the socio-demographics of the population, neighborhood attributes, how far they were from an APL, and what their preferences were about using APLs. So first, who uses APLs? Our APL users are much more frequent online shoppers than all online shoppers. So here you can see that about 2/3 of the sample shops about once a week or more. And if we look at all online shoppers, it's about 50% of them who shop about once a week or more. If we ask, why do you use an APL? you can see that the most frequent answer is it's the safest option for my package. This is followed by it's the most convenient, and then followed by it's the safest option for me, and so on. It's important to note here that hardly anybody has no other option. So using an APL is definitely a very discretionary choice. We also asked about why you chose a particular location, and the most frequent answer was proximity to home. So you can see that proximity to work is way less important than proximity to home. And then the second kind of level important factors are the availability of lockers and safety concerns. Note also, going back to what Miguel said and what I'll show you here, parking availability is actually pretty important. And that's because most everybody drives to the locker destinations. Okay, so that kind of gets us to how do we get to the APLs. This is data on the last time the person used an APL. 67% said I drive alone, and another 12% said I get a ride. So about 80% of all trips to the APLs are by private vehicle. You can see that I use bus or train is at 6%, which is just about the transit share for the area for trips in general. And there's a fair number of walk trips. In terms of trip chaining, 40% of all the trips that were taken were chained, and 44% of all the private vehicle trips that were taken were chained. So now let's talk about the classes. Class 1 is our older, I shouldn't start there, is a frequent online shopper who rarely uses the APL, almost always uses home delivery, and always when using the APL always drives. Class 2 is a less frequent shopper, an occasional APL user, and the real characteristic of this class is a much higher propensity to use non-motorized modes to access the APL. Class 3 is the most frequent online shopper, sometimes uses APLs, in other words, more than class 1 or 2, and always drives. And then class 4 is also a frequent online shopper, a more regular user of APL, is the least frequent user of home deliveries, the most frequent user of transit, and the most use of trip chaining. So if we look at the covariates, who are these people in these classes? In class 1, we have older adults, highly educated, high income. They typically have an APL between 1 and 3 miles from their house. And they only use the APL when it's the most convenient and safest option. Class 2 is our younger group. They have the largest cohort of the 25 to 44 age group, lower education level, lower income, and least likely to have a full-time job. Not surprisingly, they have the best proximity to APLs, both from home and work, meaning within 1 mile. And the APL is used because it's the most convenient and safest option. Class 3 is also a young group, has the largest share white and most likely to have a full-time job. They have close proximity to APLs from home, but not from work. And they care a lot less about convenience and safety. And then finally, class 4 is more likely to be the middle income group. They have the smallest share white, they have moderate proximity from home, and again, convenience and safety is less important for them. We did a logit estimation to look at all of these factors together. And just very briefly, I'm just going to point out in the interest of time that what didn't come up when we were looking at the covariates was population density, but it does come up when we run these models. The model itself is very consistent with all of the details I just gave you on the characteristics of the classes. So the LCA model seems to work. We do see very distinct types of APL users, and we do find that the covariates explain a lot of the difference. In terms of the users, the highest, as I said, the highest income group rarely uses APLs, so they have to be really convenient in order to use them. It's no surprise that younger adults are more likely to use non-motorized modes to get to the APL. It's also no surprise that lower income groups are the most frequent APL users, despite only moderate proximity. And what this sort of suggests to us is that there may be some sort of a mismatch with where these APLs are located. And then this lower income group also is most likely to use transit. So what's the problem with what we did? Well, we have a very small sample. As I said, about 7% of online shoppers have used an APL as far as we can tell. Therefore, it's difficult to identify them, to find them, to interview them, and there is no source of information available. It's not something that we can do with passive data, for example. And we only used one metropolitan region. We had a mixed method of survey collection, mainly because of feasibility and the cost and things like that. The research was conducted during COVID. Omicron struck when our field work was about to begin. So we had a lot of challenges in getting the sample together. And then, as Miguel pointed out, we saw this big surge in online shopping during COVID. And we don't know what parts of those behaviors are going to stick as we move out of COVID. So finally, conclusions, back to the issue. The success of APLs is going to really depend on willingness to use APLs and how they are accessed. If we can persuade people to use APLs in large numbers, that will definitely help on the consolidation side. And if we can persuade people or incentivize non-motorized trips, transit trips, chain trips, we'll be better off on the passenger side. So we do have a few recommendations. The first is to locate APLs in transit stations and walkable neighborhoods where they're most accessible by those modes. To locate APLs in lower income communities. We are concerned that there may be some disparities in terms of where APLs get located, and they may not be reflecting the demand that is potentially there in low income communities. It makes sense to focus on dense city areas where there are more opportunities for consolidation, more opportunities for non-motorized access, and more benefits from reduced truck and BMT because of high levels of congestion. So thanks very much. And I think we can go to our Q&A, and I will stop sharing.
All right, thank you, Jen. So it looks like we did have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Miguel, I see that you answered one of those through the text response. And then there was a follow-up question from the same person about, let's see, future demand. Can future demand be modeled in a way to see where the greatest impacts might be for decreased air quality and congestion? So I don't know if you, Miguel, if you want to expand on that a little bit, or if Dr. Giuliano, you would be interested in responding to this question.
I think that's a Miguel question.
Well, I provided a little bit of, a link to a project we did where we tried to analyze the equity impacts, and also Professor Giuliano had done a lot of work on that area. I think there is an understanding today among the academics that there is a lack of data about the actual movement of all these deliveries. We do a lot of work trying to estimate it, trying to come out with the routes, but there is no source of data on the actual deliveries. There's just kind of some sparse and ad hoc analysis that have received some of that data. So we do not know exactly where the vehicles are, but I think most of the data have been able to identify the origins of the flows and the destinations. So we know at the origin, and when I say origins are the warehouse and distribution centers, that there is a correlation on where they locate, and usually they locate in areas where the land is cheaper, usually where you have disadvantaged communities. And in the analysis that we did, it was not only for e-commerce, but it was in general for all the warehouses and distribution centers in, let's say, in Southern California. We found that 2/3 of all the warehouses that have been transacted in the last few years locate in a disadvantaged area by AB 755. I forget now, 355. Sorry. So yeah, there is a correlation in terms of where the facilities are, where those flows originate. There are impacts around those facilities that disproportionately affect different segments of the population. A lot of people have found, in terms of the demand side, that the higher the income, the more likely that you buy more online, and that have kind of continued throughout the last few years. So similar findings. So you could say that more higher income people are getting more benefits of e-commerce, and lower income are getting more of the intensity of the freight activity, and that will be kind of a disproportionate impact. Whether that continues or not, and I think that's why I mentioned the importance of land use, that we plan for this activity and we plan for the growth and try to mitigate the unintended consequences.
All right, thanks, Miguel. We have another question that came up. Would it be useful to include some type of GHG estimate when people are ordering their items? Perhaps seeing the relative impact of varying delivery options would encourage people to choose lockers or slower delivery.
That's a great suggestion. We're starting to see marketing like this in different industries, I think it's a great suggestion, and I'd love to see somebody like Amazon try it. Amazon entices you with discounts and coupons, right? If you're willing to do Amazon Thursday or whatever it is, you'll get some sort of a benefit. I haven't seen overt marketing to push people to APLs by Amazon, but there are some other retailers that seem to be going in that direction. So I think it's a great idea, and I think it's really worth testing.
All right, and let's see, another question. I'm interested in how both of you would use existing policies and new policy options and advocate for higher use of APLs as one option to improve freight routing and air quality impacts from last mile deliveries.
Shall I just start and then turn it over to you? As the urban planner in the room, one of the issues is with APLs and everything, everything else is planning and land use. So we need to have space for them. We need to permit them, as cities need to permit them. So one of the policy dimensions is definitely making it easier to locate lockers and actually construct them, and particularly in very dense areas. So, for example, since we were out in the field so much, if you did there, first of all, in our first survey, lots of people had no idea what a locker was, even though they were frequent online shoppers. And secondly, people, if you were to go by a location where Amazon says there are lockers, or others would say there are lockers, you wouldn't necessarily see them. You actually have to go and look for them because they're inside something else. So there's a lot of kind of information and education that would also actually help, just if people knew where they are and how they could use them.
Yeah, I just would like to add that e-commerce provides a huge level of convenience to people. And going back to the previous question, if there will be some people that will receive the signal about the comparison of the GAGs from different options and choose the one with the lowest. But I think there is still a large percentage of the consumer population that is price driven and cost driven. And unless there is probably a financial and economic signal that we need to pay as a consumer for our consumption, that could be tied to the cost of carbon, it could be tied to the frequency, it could be tied to a cap. I think we can go a long way educating, but I think there will be that last segment of the population that will require that extra push to pay for the externality and internalize that cost.
Or to reverse that and give the carrot of discounts or other perks to encourage use.
Correct.
All right, thank you. And we have just about a minute left. Another question popped up here. Maybe we can answer it quickly. Could post offices function as APLs? What levers would allow them to be better?
Well, I will just do it quickly, and but I think post offices are APLs in nature, and they already have PO boxes, and some of them, I mean, even USPS have. They trial locker boxes a few years ago. Again, it's just the same question about how do you incentivize people to use these as opposed to selecting a delivery home.
All right, thank you. Well, with that, it's 1 o'clock. I want to thank our speakers again. Thank you so much for sharing your research and taking the time to present it to us today. Really enjoyed all of this information. It was really fascinating. Also want to thank everyone who was able to call in. Thank you for joining us. And I did put a post-webinar survey in the chat. Please take a minute to fill that out so we can continue to improve these webinars in the future. And with that, I'll say thank you again, and we'll go ahead and adjourn. So happy holidays. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.